Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Research Data Preservation, a love letter to our future data communities. This is a Love Data Week panel co-hosted by Borealis and the Digital Research Alliance of Canada. My name is Julie Shee, and I'm the Digital Preservation Librarian at Scholars Portal, and I am joined by Alyssa Conlon from Borealis and Queen's University Library as co-moderator for this session.
Bonjour et bienvenue. Merci d'être présent aujourd'hui pour notre discussion table ronde préservation des données de recherche, une lettre d'amour aux communautés de données. Qui est offerte dans la semaine, dans le cadre de la semaine des données à cœur. Et puis, cette présentation est co-présentée par Borealis et l'Alliance de recherche numérique du Canada. Je m'appelle Alyssa Conlon, je suis la bibliothécaire à la gestion des données de recherche à l'Université Queen's et aussi à Borealis. Et puis, avec moi, j'ai la co-modératrice Julie Shee, qui est la bibliothécaire de préservation numérique à Scholars Portal.
And please join us as we respectfully acknowledge the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis lands upon which we all live and work. It is important that we continuously endeavor to understand the long history of these lands and recognize what those histories mean for the work of truth and reconciliation for Canadian research infrastructure. We encourage everyone in the research community to learn about the lands you call home and consider what we can do to advance reconciliation in Canada. We recognize the importance in acknowledging the land we occupy, and this is only a first step. As settlers and allies in reconciliation, we commit to reflecting on our actions and investigating how our work can support Indigenous data sovereignty and research priorities of these nations and communities. For more information, please see at Whose Land.
Veuillez vous joindre à nous pour reconnaître respectueusement les terres des Premières Nations, des Inuits et des Métis sur lesquelles nous vivons et travaillons tous. Il est important que nous nous efforçons continuellement de comprendre la longue histoire de ces terres et de reconnaître que ces histoires signifient pour le travail de vérité et de réconciliation pour l'infrastructure de recherche canadienne. Nous encourageons tous les membres de la communauté à s'informer sur les terres qu'ils considèrent comme leur foyer et à réfléchir à ce qu'ils peuvent faire pour faire progresser la réconciliation au Canada. Nous reconnaissons l'importance des terres que nous occupons et ce n'est qu'une première étape. En tant que colons et alliés de la réconciliation, nous nous engageons à réfléchir à nos actions et à étudier comment notre travail peut soutenir la souveraineté des données indigènes et la priorité de recherche des nations et des communautés. Dans la boîte de clavardage, nous allons partager un lien et puis nous vous invitons à partager et à consulter ce lien pour savoir l'histoire des terres sur lesquelles vous tenez.
The Alliance seeks to provide a welcoming, engaging, and safe community for everyone. Discriminatory language is not appropriate in any venue or platform, and the Alliance does not tolerate harassment in any form. Harassment is understood as any behavior that threatens another person or group or produces an unsafe environment.
L'Alliance s'engage à offrir à tous les participants et toutes les participantes une expérience accueillante, stimulante et sécuritaire. Les comportements discriminatoires ne sont aucunement tolérés pendant les événements ou sur les plateformes. L'Alliance n'accepte pas aucune forme de harcèlement qui est définie comme étant tout comportement qui menace une autre personne ou un groupe ou ce qui produit un environnement non sécuritaire.
And we are using Wordly to provide real-time AI translation and captions during today's session.
Nous utilisons l'outil Wordly d'IA qui est pour offrir des traductions en temps réel et des sous-titres au cours de la session aujourd'hui qui sont générés par l'intelligence artificielle. Allez voir la petite boîte pour ouvrir le logiciel et puis il va y avoir aussi un lien dans la boîte de clavardage.
This Love Data Week, we've been asking, where's the data? Research data management services and data deposit requirements that have been growing over the past decades have also worked to encourage researchers to store and share their data so it can be found. And the FAIR principles of findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability provide practical guidance to make the task of discovering and locating data even easier. Data that is fair today may not be fair tomorrow, though, and once data is curated and deposited, we must then preserve to ensure research data can be found, accessed, understood, and used into the future. This panel brings together speakers from across Canada to share case studies and practical examples of how institutions are approaching research data preservation. Presentations are in English with slides in French and English, and will be followed by a bilingual Q&A period moderated by Alyssa. Questions are welcome in French and English during Q&A.
Cette année, pour la Semaine des données à cœur, nous nous sommes lancés sur la trace des données. Les services de gestion des données de recherche et les exigences de dépôt de données qui se sont développées au cours des dernières années ont également encouragé les chercheurs et les chercheuses à stocker et partager les données où elles peuvent être trouvées. Les principes FAIR, pour rendre les données facilement trouvables, accessibles, interopérables et réutilisables, offrent un cadre pratique pour encourager la retrouvabilité des données. Les données qui suivent ces principes aujourd'hui ne le seront pas nécessairement demain. Cependant, une fois les données curatées et déposées, nous devons les préserver afin d'assurer qu'elles peuvent être trouvées, utilisées et comprises à la Aujourd'hui, cette table ronde rassemble des panélistes de partout au Canada et les invite à partager des études de cas et des exemples concrets pour démontrer comment les instituts de recherche prennent à cœur la préservation des données et de recherche. Les présentations sont en anglais, cependant les diapositives sont écrites en français et en anglais. Et puis, nous allons suivre les présentations par une période de questions-réponses bilingues. Je vous invite à poser toutes les questions en français ou en anglais dans la langue qui vous convient.
And on that note, we'll turn it over to our presenters.
Donc, sur ce, je vais inviter nos panélistes à prendre la parole. Nous avons aussi un lien avec une petite biographie de nos panélistes. Donc, première personne à prendre la parole, c'est Amanda Thomé, qui est la coordinatrice de préservation numérique au sein de l'Alliance de recherche numérique du Canada, où elle est responsable des activités de préservation numérique liées au dépôt fédéré de données de recherche. First up is Amanda Thomé, who is the Digital Preservation Coordinator with the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, where she is responsible for digital preservation activities associated with the Federated Research Data Repository. Amanda?
Thanks,
The floor is all
Alyssa.
yours.
Thanks. Hi everyone. I'm Amanda, and as mentioned in the introduction, I'm the Digital Preservation Coordinator with the Digital Research Alliance of Canada. And in this role, I am primarily responsible for the long-term preservation and retention of research data deposited in our Federated Research Data Repository, what we call FRDR. Next slide, please, Tanya. It is an honor to be a part of this inaugural Love Data Week Digital Preservation panel with my colleagues and to have the opportunity to discuss digital preservation with the research data community. Next slide. Today I'll provide a very, very brief overview of preservation, as preservation may not be a stage of the research data lifecycle everyone is familiar with. Then another very brief overview of FRDR to put the preservation work we do in context. And finally, I'll provide a brief description of how FRDR's digital preservation services loves the data in the repository. Next slide. So when digital preservation is defined preservation, we often use the following definition by the Digital Preservation Coalition to describe our work. The definition states that digital preservation is a series of managed activities necessary to ensure continued access to digital materials for as long as necessary. Next slide, please, Tanya. Digital preservation refers to all of the actions required to maintain access to digital materials beyond the limits of media failure or technological and organizational change. So this is a good definition when talking to other preservationists or information professionals, but doesn't really provide much in the way of concrete examples to allow users to visualize what digital preservation actions might look like. And this is important when working with researchers, as they may not be familiar with preservation. Next slide. Thanks. So let's try this. All digital files have a lifespan. A file may no longer be usable because the file format is no longer popular and is therefore no longer supported by the vendor or the community that developed it. The software used to generate or render the file may no longer be available, or new versions of that software are not compatible with older formats. The examples I just used, which are by no means exhaustive, illustrate different risks associated with digital content. Preservation then includes different activities that are undertaken on the digital files to mitigate these risks and allow files to be available beyond their lifespan. One activity may include, next slide, normalization, which is the process of converting the original files to a select few non-proprietary file formats. In the example on the slide, the normalization process involves converting all objects of a specific content type, in this instance raster images, so your PNGs, your JPEGs, to one format, in this case an uncompressed TIFF. It is important to note that originals are always maintained in normalization scenarios. They are not deleted or overwritten. So next slide. So in the context of research data then, engaging in preservation means data reuse in the long term. It isn't enough just to have access. the data needs to be reused. Next slide. When we hear the word digital, our minds tend to go straight to technology, and understandably so. But it's important to note that digital preservation is not just about technology. Technology alone will not solve the problem of long-term access and reuse. It needs to work in conjunction with preservation planning, documentation, and adequate resourcing, including funding and people. Next slide. Okay, so now we're going to look at how we do, we're going to take a brief overview of FRDR. And next slide. Sorry, that was a short turnover, Tanya. First, let's start with a brief overview of FRDR. For those of you that may not be familiar with the repository, FRDR is a general purpose bilingual publishing platform for sharing and preservation of Canadian research data. The repository launched in February 2021 and is administered by the Digital Research Alliance of Canada. So the repository is built to support researchers with medium to large size data sets, although we do welcome small data sets as well, and is open to researchers in any discipline. FRDR provides a list of recommended file types for research data. However, the repository does not restrict deposits if the files within the dataset fall outside those we recommend. By default, depositors are given an allocation of 1 terabyte of storage, but this can be increased with justification. FRDR allows for the creation of collections to allow research outputs from research groups, labs, and cross-institutional research programs to be located in one place. And finally, but probably most importantly, FRDR offers curation and digital preservation services to research data deposited in the repository. Next slide. As FRDR is a general purpose repository, we get deposits from a variety of research domains as demonstrated on this slide. And while it's great for researchers from any discipline to have a place to publish their research data, it does create some challenges for digital preservation activities, as this comes with many different formats and research outputs from domains we aren't necessarily familiar with, which can then be difficult to put their research in context and understand the data's long-term needs. Next slide. Now, I've chosen to call this presentation, What's Love Got to Do with It? The Trials and Tribulations of the Preservation of Research Data, A, because, well, it's Love Data Week, and B, because digital preservation in any environment is difficult. As demonstrated in the previous slide, for instance, the proliferation of many research domains leads to difficulty making appraisal decisions, as well as understanding all the formats we are trying to preserve, which in FRDR's case is quite a lot. Digital preservation, go back one. Not yet. Thanks. Digital preservation is not, in my opinion, always straightforward and is often an afterthought. And when we discuss digital preservation in the context of research data, we are really in the infancy of exploring what that means. The truth is, yes, digital preservation is hard, but doing nothing, in my opinion, is worse than doing something, no matter how small. Digital preservation activities, or what I will call for this presentation, loving the data, can take on many different faces. It can start with a basic understanding and listing of your holdings for intellectual control, an analysis of the risk associated with a data set that may impede long-term access or reuse, copies of your holdings in different places. No matter where you are starting, any action demonstrates love and commitment to digital preservation work. And remember, love can grow. So how do we love the data in FRDR? Next slide. I feel that the first place to start with digital preservation is to know what you have. You can't start preservation if you don't know what you're aiming to keep around. To that end, each dataset in FRDR gets a listing developed and associated with the dataset. The listing is basic with the dataset publication ID, file path, format, if it's known, and an extension. And you figure getting a file listing of a dataset would be relatively easy. However, given the size of the datasets in FRDR, this is a challenge, and a move of the dataset to one of our high-performance computing clusters is needed to undertake this work. For the really large datasets, scripts for submitting jobs to the clusters need to be developed, as it can take several hours to several days to generate a list. Next slide. Given the volume of datasets and the number of files some of these datasets include, understanding file formats so we can make digital preservation decisions can be tricky. At FRDR, format identification work builds on the previous file listing work that I've highlighted. And when the file list is complete, we add it to a CSV that we have designated for a specific dataset range based on the dataset's publication number. Once a quarter, these CSVs are run through a script that we've generated to get stats related to the amount of formats identified and the number of files associated with that format. We equally get an output of everything that is unknown. The unknown files are then investigated and notes taken. If the format has a signature, which is also known as magic bytes, which is a unique identifier embedded into the bytes of the file, then a signature is created for submission to the Pronom database so others can use it to help identify their files. In this way, we are not only caring for our own collections, but helping others care for theirs. Next slide. Different preservation levels are assigned to datasets of portions of datasets that outline the repository's capabilities in terms of preservation and long-term access. All datasets go through a basic level of preservation, and this basic level includes the preservation of the bit streams or the ones and zeros of the file, with the addition of fixity checking, so verifying that the file has not altered or is corrupted, safe and replicated storage, and virus checking. Watch level includes datasets with files that are proprietary but are prevalent in the industry that the likelihood of obsolescence is, well, unlikely. The watch level includes elements of the basic level with additional preservation activities of monitoring formats, generation of preservation metadata, and file identification. Full level includes files that the repository has confidence will be available in the long term because they are commonly used, the formats are open and documented, or the formats can be transformed to preservation-friendly formats. So full preservation includes everything from the basic and watch level with the additional preservation activities of migration of file formats to preservation-friendly formats when necessary, format validation, which includes whether the process of whether the format conforms to its specification if one exists, and characterization, so the extraction of technical metadata embedded in the files. And as technology changes and things evolve, datasets may move between the different tiers. Next slide. And last, by no means least, we develop preservation plans that outline not only the preservation levels I discussed, but also include our risk analysis results, the categorization of our file formats into different content types, and our preservation actions. The preservation plan can change and expand as needed and forms part of our format policy registry, which is available to the public. The preservation plan is how we show others how we love the data in our care. And next slide. And with that high-level overview of digital preservation in Further, I would like to now turn it over to my colleagues to share their amazing digital preservation work. And I would like to thank all those in attendance for taking the time to listen, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Amanda, for this great presentation. Up next, we have Lucia Costanzo. Lucia is the Research Data Management Librarian at the University of Guelph with over 20 years of experience supporting researchers working with all types of data. Lucia est la bibliothécaire en gestion de données de recherche à l'Université Guelph et elle possède plus de 20 ans d'expérience dans le soutien aux chercheurs qui utilisent divers types de données. Lucia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will begin with a beginner's journey into research data preservation. Next slide. I'm presenting this from the perspective of someone going through the permafrost onboarding for the first time. I came in with some technical skills. I am comfortable with organizing files, working with structured data, and learning new systems, but I did not have a background in digital preservation or in Archivematica. I was not approaching this project as an expert, but I was not starting from zero. And today I wanted to briefly share what that experience looked like, especially in terms of what technical skills were actually needed and what weren't needed. Next slide. Going in, I expected the technical barrier to be much higher. I thought I would need to have an in-depth knowledge of programming and scripting skills, have a deep Archivematica knowledge or preservation standards right away. I also assumed that we would need to design perfect workflows before starting, and none of that turned out to be true, especially during the onboarding, and I wanted to thank Julie and the team who made it a really great experience. Next slide. The technical skills that I actually used were much more practical. Most of the time was spent organizing files, applying naming conventions, and preparing small test transfers. Time was also spent working with metadata with a focus to describe the content clearly, and I spent time understanding the file formats and what normalization means, but also at a decision level and not at a technical one. Archivematica, it handled the heavy lifting, and the team's role was really to make choices and to follow guided workflows. Most of the work was about preparation and decision making and not technical configuration. Next slide. The hardest parts were not technical, but it was the judgment calls, deciding when to normalize files, whether to create apes or dips, and figuring out how much metadata was enough took some trial and error. And working within size and processing limits also forced us to think carefully about what to test and how. Next slide. What helped the most was the onboarding structure itself and knowing that the packages could be deleted and workflows could be changed and nothing was permanent. And it made it really safe to experiment. Having active support and documentation and regular check-ins and not figuring things out alone was very helpful. My biggest takeaway was that the permafrost onboarding wasn't about mastering the technology behind the scenes, but it was really more about building confidence, shared understanding, and realistic workflows within our team at the University of Guelph. And for me, as a first-time user with some technical skills, I found that the onboarding was less about learning new tools, but more learning about how to make good preservation decisions. Thank you, and I hope sharing this first-time perspective makes the onboarding process much more approachable. And my main takeaway was that you don't need to be a preservation expert or highly technical specialist to begin. You just really need a thoughtful preparation, a willingness to test and adjust, and an openness to learning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucia. Up next, we have Julie Shee, my co-moderator. Julie Shee is the Digital Preservation Librarian at Scholars Portal, where she coordinates the permafrost hosted for Informatica Services and Ontario Library Research Cloud Storage Network. La prochaine présentation est de Julie Shee, qui est la bibliothécaire en préservation numérique à Scholars Portal, où elle gère le service Permafrost hébergé sur Informatica et le réseau de stockage en nuage Ontario Library Research Cloud. Julie Shee, over to you.
Thanks, Alyssa. And I promise this was not intended as a permafrost booster session. But today I'll be zooming in on the preservation activity of file format identification and an exploratory project that we've been working on at Borealis with our wonderful intern, Ada Liu. And Borealis is a national Canadian data repository that's built on the Dataverse software. Next slide, please. To begin, why identify file formats? Amanda went into this a little bit already, but knowing what formats are in your collections is a crucial first step to help you understand the scope of what you're working with. Once you're able to name the unique formats in your care and the extent of their presence, you can then determine which formats are at risk of becoming unusable, and therefore what information is at risk of becoming difficult or impossible to access. These assessments can then be used to establish priorities and action plans for future access and reuse. Given the importance of identification, we wanted to understand how Dataverse identifies file formats and how Dataverse compares to Droid and Siegfried, which are two format identification tools that were created by the digital preservation community. We compare these tools as each approaches identification differently. And for this work, we looked at identification results for 1,031 files across 17 datasets that are published in Borealis. In Dataverse, file extensions and MIME types are mapped to human-readable friendly types when files are ingested. These are good starting points, but they don't provide enough detail for preservation all the time. For instance, the Dataverse friendly type MS Word can refer to 2 MIME types, but also to 23 different versions of Microsoft Word. So have we really identified the format in use? Next slide, please. Alongside MIME types and extensions, Droid and Siegfried look at the internal structure of a file and reference Pronom to determine which format the structure corresponds to. And Pronom is a registry of format information created by the UK National Archives, and each recorded format is assigned a PUID unique identifier. Where Droid will assign the most viable match after scanning all available options in Pronom, Siegfried references Pronom and other sources and will assign the first viable match. Next slide, please. At a high level, Dataverse identified MIME types for 677 of the 1,031 files represented in the dataset metadata record. This means that Dataverse was not able to identify the format of around 350 files, or 34% of our sample. That said, there's a significant difference in the number of formats identified by Droid and Siegfried, with Siegfried assigning MIME types and PUID unique identifiers to roughly 200 more files than Dataverse did, and Droid identified less than 200 by either method. Since Siegfried references more sources, it is perhaps unsurprising that it has more coverage. Next slide, please. In terms of accuracy, though, Droid appears to do better if we take Dataverse to be our source of truth, with 92% of the MIME types identified by Droid matching those identified by Dataverse, whereas just 23% of Siegfried's identifications matched. Droid and Siegfried also agreed on the PUID for 194 files, which is all but one of the total PUIDs that Droid assigned, but only 22% for Siegfried. Next slide, please. And to make things more interesting, we also received more files than we bargained for. Because zipped archives such as zips, gzips, and tars can be deposited in Dataverse by double zipping, the 734 files we expected from 4 of our sample datasets turned out to be more than 154,800 files. Dataverse does not unpack the full contents of double zipped files, and so not only does the dataset metadata not give us a sense of the true size of each dataset, we also cannot rely on Dataverse to identify the formats of the files within. Next slide, please. Coverage also varies by discipline and data types. This example dataset contains Esri ArcGIS files. The context and purpose of these files isn't necessarily clear from Dataverse alone, though, with only one format correctly identified, 3 assigned overly broad or generic labels in purple, and 2 completely unknown. Droid and Siegfried, by contrast, provide much better coverage and accuracy, with all but one format unknown to both the tools and one format misidentified by Siegfried in green. Next slide, please. In another intriguing case, we have a set of files created for use with the HydroGeosphere software for 3D groundwater models and simulations. Droid did not identify any of the 7 unique formats present, but Siegfried and Dataverse arguably didn't perform much better. Siegfried does make an identification for all 7 formats, but only one is completely accurate. While plaintext is not exactly incorrect for the other 6 formats, since they can be opened and read in a plaintext viewer, it does not reflect their actual purpose or context. Similarly, Dataverse's designation of the ASC file format as a fixed field text data format reflects the data structure, but not the actual ArcView ASCII grid file format. So along with the challenges of differentiating between plain text formats, this also raises a question of what information is actually helpful and how we can make sure that information is useful. Next slide, please. So the conversation is ongoing, and this was just a snapshot of our work, but I hope it was interesting and demonstrated some of the importance and complexity of understanding the files and formats in your collections and their implications for future access and use. If you'd like to learn more, stay tuned for a project report and fuller presentation at a Borealis community meeting in the coming months. And thank you for your time, and looking forward to any questions.
Thanks, Julie. Up next, we have Adele, who joined CRKN as Manager for Heritage Services in 2025. Adele is an archivist who has been working with documentary heritage for over 20 years. La prochaine présentation vient de Adele, qui s'est jointe au RCDR en 2025 à titre de gestionnaire des services du patrimoine. Archiviste de formation, elle œuvre dans le domaine du patrimoine documentaire depuis plus de 20 ans. Adele, over to you.
Thank you. I'm so pleased to join the panel today. I'm going to tell a story that transcends technologies and time. It is a story of a preservation and access project that we currently called Canadiana. Next slide, please. So, for those who aren't familiar with Canadiana, the Canadiana Collections and Infrastructure together are one of the largest openly accessible online resources of digitized Canadian documentary heritage, with more than 69 million pages of publications and archival records that span the 1500s to the present day. More than a collection, it is Canadian university-owned research infrastructure that enables the preservation, discovery, and research of Canada's documentary record at scale. Canadiana is funded by the Canadian Research Knowledge Network's member libraries. So, in the story, I'm going to take us back to the beginning about building Canadiana, and then we're going to move to the digital access era, and then we're going to sort of dwell on the idea of Canadiana as data, and the exciting conclusion, the preservation of Canadiana. Next slide, please. So, to begin at the beginnings, the 1970s, you had the Commission on Canadian Studies, the Simons Report, as well as the Canada Council Consultative Group on University Research Libraries, raising the alarm that there was not great access to primary source materials or the kind of sources that are needed to pursue Canadian studies research. And so the answer in 1978 the Canadian Institute for Historical Microreproductions was created. And on the screen here, you see a very long quote. In the next slide, you'll see the French, I believe. And I like this quote because it really captures the aspects of the Institute's mission very well. You'll see that preservation is at the heart of the mission early on. You also observe that it's based on a technology, microreproductions, but the mission was also really about access and almost equity or equitable access. They wanted these collections that were fragmented and could be found throughout Canada and outside of Canada to be brought together and to be available to all research libraries in Canada. So next slide, please. Oh, next one. Sorry, for those who wanted to read the French quote. This is a technology. For those who might not have ever used microfiche collections, you could see that there's some data captured in them and preserved on the microfiche. The scope of the Canadiana collection was very ambitious. Materials on Canadian or on Canada or on Canadians or written by Canadians. So quite a broad amount of material brought together through this great access and preservation technology, microfiche. Next slide, please. So moving the plot forward to the digital era. In 1996, the Institute applied for the first time for a license that would take into account the possibility of providing materials in digital format for the future. And the Copyright Board granted them this ability in 1997, but they only granted them the right to produce 75 CD-ROMs of the collection and to distribute them to subscribers. Okay, but at the same time, the internet was happening. In 1997, the Institute started its first digitization project. A selection of 3,000 fiches were digitized and made available on the Canadiana.org website. That collection was called the Early Canadian Online Collection, and it was available through a license. There was also the Early Official Publications Collection. Some of the material was available outside of the paywall, but other material you had to subscribe to. This was the era of digital libraries. And in 2008, the Institute gets renamed because it merges with another digital library called Alouette Canada. And they created a new organization called Canadiana.org. So really in the internet era now, and making the collection accessible online. Another major milestone in 2015, the Canadiana Trusted Digital Repository was certified. Lastly, I would say, it's not on the slide, there was a merger with the Canadian Research Knowledge Network in 2018, and that was an access milestone because that was the members of CRCan voted to remove the paywall in 2019. So also this new entity that was created, CRCan, or the continuation of CRCan, meant that Canadiana also embraced its mission to collaborate to advance digital scholarship. Next slide, please. Okay, here's some perhaps unnecessary plot twist in the story. Is Canadiana data? Is it research data? Should I be on this panel? In Canada, you will find government publications and documents, archival records, monographs, serials, and maps. So unstructured data. In their article, Research Data Management in Humanities, Higgins, Goddard, and Kerr describe data as something that should be considered collectively and produced. Okay, so again, where are we in the food chain? Are we people that preserve research data? I'm not sure, but we sort of get closer perhaps to there's a process of datafication when we start to OCR and ICR records that are handwritten, intelligent character recognition using tools like Transcribus. It's a little bit closer to research data. perhaps because it makes the corpus available for computational use. Um, so, one last digression. Uh, this the data that you can find in Canadiana is not just humanities and social sciences data. So next slide, please. Hopefully I will demonstrate that. Okay, so yeah, you can advance all the little animations, please, Tanya. Um, okay, so it's not just humanities and social sciences data. Historic observations can be found not only in Canadian government reports that could extend natural science data sets with, of course, researcher adjustments for bias through time. And also the aggregation of these fragmented collections might produce new knowledge because you might be able to pull in texts in other languages, contemporaneous news coverage in newspapers that also is available in Canadiana, even maybe works of fiction about the Arctic. So depending on how you build or produce the data, you may be able to answer scientific research questions with Canadiana as well. So that's a bit of a digression, but now on to the exciting conclusion. Canadiana, its preservation. Here on the screen, you'll see a diagram of the Canadiana infrastructure, access and preservation infrastructure. On the QR codes, you should hopefully be able to pull up the public documentation that was produced with the recertification of the repository that ended in 2023. I will also say that our archival information packages are pretty simple compared to the other ones that we saw earlier in the presentations. Well, we have the still images files of the documents, TIFF files and JPEG files. We also have METS XML files, and then it's packaged together back in place. And then you have things like the text files with the checksum or fixity values. Something that might be interesting to people is that our early archival information packages, our APEs, had our OCR files in them as well. But a policy decision over time, we decided that we would regularly re-OCR the collection as tools improved through time. So it wasn't really necessary to keep those OCR files in our preservation package or our archival information package. So, other things we're wondering about what to preserve in Canadiana and what not to. In the late spring, Canadiana will transition to the next generation of its infrastructure. We will be using IIIF tools. And with those tools, we could harvest other collections that are fragmented or fragments of our fragmented collection. We can also more easily receive shared collections. And so we're asking ourselves, should they be added to the corpus in terms of the preservation mandate, though we aren't really their stewards? And then also, I mean, where are we in the food chain again? I bring that up because researchers through our our APIs and being able to computationally manipulate the corpus might produce things like annotations to the IIIF interfaces that we could possibly feed back into the preservation corpus. But is this where Canadiana and its preservation story ends, and where these research outputs should really be preserved in a repository like Borealis instead? We're not sure, if these manipulations should feed back into the Canadiana preservation mandate. Okay, a bit of a cliffhanger to end. Next slide, please. Thank you. Merci pour votre attention. That was Canadiana, a preservation and access love story. Yes, thank you. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Adèle. La prochaine présentation est Marie-Catherine Shea, qui est la spécialiste en soutien aux données données en gestion de données de recherche à l'Université d'Ottawa. Up next, we have Mary Catherine Shea, who works as Data Support Specialist in Research Data Management with the University of Ottawa Library.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much. Welcome to this lightning talk on some early experiences we've had at U Ottawa, translating some historical archives into our instance of the Borealis Research Data Repository, which locally is U Ottawa Dataverse. Next slide, please. It represents a collaboration with the archival donors, with the head of archives and special collections, Marina Bokove, with the RDM Library Department, and with work undertaken by the digital archivist Sasha Blaise. The project's purpose is to increase dataset representation for underrepresented groups and to serve as useful resources for analysis within diverse fields, such as social history, history, and feminist and gender studies. The project is a pilot for a potential wider collaboration between the Archives and Special Collections and Library RDM to make the women in STEM archival collections, so from science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, more widely available as data sets. And it's still very much currently under development. So I won't read aloud our collection descriptions, but will highlight that the dataset is part of a thematic grouping of fonds that focuses on women in STEM fields. The data that formed the basis for this pilot were created by Monique Fries and Claire Deschênes for their book-length work, Women's Contribution to Science and Technology through ICWST Conferences, the acronym for the International Conference of Women Engineers and Scientists. Their authors are well-known engineers and have also contributed to social history on women in STEM. Next slide, please. Alors, ce tableau comparatif des disciplines a été utile pour comprendre les liens entre la pratique archivistique du classement et la pratique de la gestion des données de recherche en matière de dépôt de données. Chaque niveau de classement archivistique correspond assez bien à un Borealis Dataverse. Les deux domaines sont également soumis à des paramètres similaires qui guident notre travail dans le traitement des fonds et la conservation des ensembles de données, afin de rendre les collections plus largement accessibles. Tous ces paramètres contribuent donc à la création du produit final en rendant les collections plus accessibles et en les préservant à long terme. Next slide, please. So following on this discipline crosswalk and our work within those parameters to make collections accessible and preserve them for the long term, we ended up with the dataset deposit consisting of 39 files collected on subject, sessions, subtopics, and papers that form part of the International Conferences of Women Engineers and Scientists from 1964 to 2002. It's a series in the equivalent finding aid and a single dataset in Borealis. Some of our early takeaways were to capitalize on existing expertise, to avoid duplication of efforts, and to establish time-saving strategies. For example, to facilitate the process of ascertaining intellectual property, Marina, the archives head, suggested the archives create a clause in the donor agreement or deed of gift upon acquisition, stipulating that creators retain their data's copyright, since copyright by default, like most archives, is normally transferred to the archive. Sometimes this will need to be verified within the RDM department and also through the Copyright Office, as there are various scenarios that might affect data copyright. For example, we did discover intellectual property differs for data sets that form the basis for book-length works versus scholarly articles, but the clause will hopefully in the long run represent a time-saving measure. And we currently have a digital archivist creating the permanent archived copy of the data, since our instance of Borealis is not yet integrated into Archivematica. So the digital archivist preserves the electronic records, ensuring there's a permanent preservation copy, and also ensuring the archives are upholding their mandate to permanently preserve the donor's records, including data, since the data exists as both digital object and intellectual record within the archive. And the RDM Data Support Specialist undergoes the usual curatorial review, ensuring the data deposited by the digital archivist meets standards for long-term access and for fairness, so findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. Because I was involved in the curation work as a special project, I undertook several additional tasks, including creating the dataset README file, though it is by no means exhaustive. So for this reason, we might also request during the archival acquisition that donors provide contextual information regarding their research and methodologies. A crosswalk from the finding aid to the README file and the metadata fields that I created helps render the data accessible without losing some of the key contextual archival information. It's a very informal crossword without a walk, without scope or definitions, but I'm happy to share it with anyone interested as it might help facilitate the work. Some less tangible factors that contributed to this project's success included the willingness of both departments to work on the project, the donors' enthusiasm, and the head archivist's positive relationship with the archival donors. It's probably fair to say the curation work that went into the project was about twice what it usually is, and that's not including time spent in meetings, the creation of tools like crosswalks, and questions related to the Copyright Office. So thank you so much for your time and attention, everyone.
Thank you, Mary Catherine. Up next, we have Natalie Vidbar. She is the Digital Curation Archivist in the Research Services and Digital Strategies Unit of the University of Manitoba Libraries. La prochaine personne est Nathalie Vielfort, qui est l'archiviste de curation numérique des services de recherche et de stratégie numérique de la Bibliothèque de l'Université du Manitoba. Nathalie, allez-y.
Thank you. So today I'll be talking a bit about our CORTRA SEAL process. If you're not familiar with CORTRA SEAL, it's an international non-governmental organization that reviews data repositories, and where repositories meet those standards for sustainability, data management, preservation, CORTRA SEAL then certifies the repositories as trustworthy. I also just wanted to mention before I start off that this process was very much a team effort, and I want to give proper credit to that. I was a co-applicant for the CORTRA SEAL submission along with the Research Services and Digital Strategies Coordinator, Jordan Bass. Our RDM librarian, Janet Rothney, was also involved in our migration to Borealis and has been providing input throughout both the CORTRA SEAL process and the process of implementing things after the fact. We also received support from our library systems, our university IT, and units across the libraries and the university. Next slide, please. So just to put the whole process kind of into context, the University of Manitoba Library set up a local hosted instance of Dataverse in 2016. This was in place at our institution before things like OneDrive and SharePoint, and I mentioned this because at the time, it wasn't just a space for data deposit, it was very much also one of few options for researchers who were looking for a collaborative space to share their data with research team members, project stakeholders, not just after the research was done, but also throughout the active stages of research. In 2018, a new unit, Research Services and Digital Strategies, or RSDS, was created in the libraries. RSDS was supporting services related to research data, open scholarship, digital preservation, digital curation, GIS, and data visualization. And so as part of that, they began facilitating the deposit process, either working directly with the researchers looking to deposit or with the liaison librarians who then worked with researchers in their subject areas working through deposit. In 2021, we joined a cohort of CORTRA SEAL applicants through Endrio. That gave us an opportunity to get feedback, hear about other people's experiences with the CORTRA SEAL process, and then move the application forward. We submitted our first application in 2022. We received our first feedback in 2023, and then we migrated in the middle of that to Borealis. And so our local instance moved into Borealis in 2023. We continued to receive revisions and feedback through the CORTRA SEAL process up until 2025 when we received our certification. Next slide, please. So from start to finish, the CTS process took us about 4 years. We had some challenges along the way. Migrating to Borealis was a big endeavor. All migrations are. On the positive side of that, though, we were able to replace any documentation specific to our local instance that we had previously referenced in our first application with documentation that Borealis made accessible. So it didn't disrupt our CTS application to a significant extent. It didn't prevent us from continuing on with the process of getting revisions and feedback. The revisions themselves were a bit challenging as well. We went in knowing that we were expecting revisions. I'm not sure if this has changed since, but at the time we started the process, we were told no one had yet submitted an application without receiving revisions. And so we were expecting that, but I think where the challenge was is that we never really knew how much to expect. Sometimes we'd receive a little less than the last time, and then the time after that it would be more. And then we also didn't really know when to expect them. So it was kind of harder to plan things out. And that kind of ties into another challenge, which was just the kind of institutional changes that happened throughout that process. Sometimes feedback came in and someone that we were actively engaging in this process with was on leave, or we had different priorities that were taking a lot more time that we couldn't jump right back into the revision process. Organizational decisions too, like moving to Borealis or even our university's web migration, meant that we had to not only revise our application to address specific feedback, but also to keep replacing documentation that had since been superseded. There's just, again, organizational change in a 4-year period. And so some of the things we'd originally linked to and referred to were then updated, or they linked to something different. And so we kind of had to keep on top of those things as well. I think another challenge was that we started off thinking of ourselves as an institution with a data repository, and the CTS process very much wanted us to think about the repository kind of independent of the institution. And so some of our documentation was institutional documentation that talked about our local Dataverse instance, and they kind of wanted policies that were just very specific to Dataverse only. The move to Borealis definitely helped there because all that documentation was centered around the repository, so we didn't have to do all these revisions or potentially skew institutional policies to talk more about Dataverse than other repositories. Next slide, please. So right now we're still working on implementing some of the requirements we referenced as being in progress in our application. Borealis provides us with some preservation support, but we are working to integrate our local digital preservation infrastructure into the process so that we can pull some deposits into our Archivematica instance when more robust preservation support is needed. We're trying to engage with researchers on topics like digital preservation and curation early on in the research process. Researchers can use our research storage data finder to see what repositories support or facilitate preservation when they're looking at deposit options. We're also in the process of developing a transfer tool, which we're calling Datum, where researchers can transfer their data to us ahead of deposit if they're looking for curation or preservation guidance. When researchers ask about depositing in Borealis, we also have questions about data retention and expectations as part of that intake process to help us assess the level of curation or preservation support that might be needed to get researchers to start thinking about what they want their data to look like in 10 years, 15 years, 50 years. We're also in the early stages of re-examining older data that predates our core trust seal process. So as I previously mentioned, some of those earliest deposits were stored in Dataverse to more so facilitate collaborative work. And so we're revisiting those earliest deposits to make sure that there's no unspoken expectations from researchers who might have just wanted it there for, the active phase of their research, or maybe they wanted it there for active phases, but also for like a long-term deposit option. So we're kind of engaging with researchers that, deposited with us a few years ago. Last slide, please. So that's essentially where we're at, how we got there. I included links to our Dataverse in Borealis, as well as our research data storage finder, and my email's there as well if anyone has questions later and wants to reach out. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Nathalie. Et notre dernière présentation est de Corey Davis, qui est un bibliothécaire de préservation numérique aux bibliothèques de l'Université de Victoria, où il contribue aux outils, aux processus et aux stratégies de stockage qui assurent l'accès continu aux collections numériques. Our last presentation is Corey Davis, who is the Digital Preservation Librarian at the University of Victoria Libraries, where he works on the tool, workflows, and storage strategies that keep digital collections accessible over the long term. Corey, what is yours?
Thanks, Alyssa, and thanks everyone for joining me today. I'm going to be talking about a little bit of a higher level. So, Natalie, it was really great to hear about the core trust seal journey that you've undertaken, because we went through something very similar. But I guess today I wanted to focus a little bit before we turn the discussion on. I don't know if any of you have had this sensation where you're sitting in a normal meeting talking about the things that you do at work on one of those like really heavy news days where the world seems to be kind of blowing up, and just sort of wondering like, why are we not talking more about this? So I think that for this really brief presentation, and I'm really just starting to think through these types of things. So I apologize if it's still a bit still a bit prototypey, but really thinking about at research libraries, um, at universities, how the world has changed and how much more unstable and unpredictable it's become, especially in relation to this idea of trust and how do we think about trust or trusted? How does that change, especially in terms of concepts like custody and succession planning? I don't have all the answers, but I'm hoping that we can start to think together as a community about how to address some of these bigger issues. So, next slide, please. So, one of the big things that Core Trust Seal makes you do is take a really good look at your processes and your documentation, etc. So one of the things that we became very focused on was this idea of ensuring that we have local custody of our materials. So making sure that there is a transfer of bags or archival information packages from the Borealis hosted infrastructure to local infrastructure so that we have direct legal and technical control. Also implementing Archivematica so we could move from simple bit storage to sort of active functional preservation. We've heard about that today. But a really big thing here, I think, is around succession planning. So in the Core Trust Seal, really what you say when you're a research library is sort of like, we're not a research project that's funded every 3 to 5 years. We're this thing that's going to be around forever. Research data management is part of the core funding for the library, and really succession planning in many ways is about what do we do if we need to migrate from this hosted Dataverse instance. But I think when we look around the world, we need to think about what if the institution or the library itself is pressured, defunded, legally compelled to delete materials. The plan stops really being about this kind of platform runbook around platform migration to bigger ideas of governance, of custody, of jurisdictions, and decision authority design. So, I mean, a key constraint up front is if you're legally ordered to delete something, you generally can't and shouldn't plan to secretly evade that as an institution. We may be in a position, and I think we really need to understand that this is a real risk these days, and some of our institutions will inevitably be dealing with these types of issues. So, how do we design our stewardship so that that risk is reduced and continuity is maintained through ideas of like distributed custody, so no one single institution is a sole point of failure, even if that institution is a university or a research library. Next slide, please. Just wanted to highlight here, and many of you will have seen these news stories around, um, Canada, the EU waking up to the fact that we are so reliant on US-based infrastructure, and the US has become a very different type of partner these days. And really, this idea of any single funding jurisdiction, whether it be the United States or even a province like Ontario, where Scholars Portal and Borealis is based, we need to think about what happens when that jurisdiction becomes more volatile or unreliable. Obviously, Ontario is a really good partner right now. BC's, a place where research libraries are okay, but that could change in the future. Um, Legislation like the Cloud Act that many of you have heard about means that server location doesn't really matter if you're partnering with other, especially US-based institutions. I'm going to talk about one of the small things we've done at UVic to mitigate against these types of issues. So really for Canadian digital collections, we need to kind of do two things. We need to mitigate the risks of relying on infrastructure that may be in a specific funded jurisdiction, but also at the same time, we need to think extra jurisdictionally. What if things go downhill within Canada itself? Next slide, please. So as we all know, I won't spend too much time on this, but this is a real thing, and this is a real problem, much more in the US right now than in Canada. But we can't think of ourselves as having a free pass when it comes to these types of trends that we may see come come north in the future. And the data rescue movements, or not movies, sometimes feels like we're living in movies, but they they're amazing people doing amazing work, but in many cases it's reactive and it's during the middle of an emergency, and it's taking place at a time when the data is already under threat. So how do we ensure that we're proactive in terms of our building our preservation infrastructure for long-term access around research data? Okay, next slide, please. So what does this look like at UVic? Maybe sovereign isn't the right word, but what what we do is anytime we have our data hosted in the cloud, whether that's through Internet Archive, through Borealis, if we move to Scalaris for our institutional repository, we make absolute sure that we have copies of that content in standardized formats like Bagot, that we have local custody of that stuff. So we've developed a workflow with the folks at Scholars Portal, and thank you, Julie, and others, that every 6 months we get Bagot exports of all of our content in Borealis. Through our OLRC subscription, we download those locally. We are just waiting to finish up some of our digital asset management system prep, and we'll be processing those through Archivematica. And then we store those on local disk with offsite tape backup. And we also have a copy of Last Resort stored. Now, this used to be on Amazon Web Services, Deep Glacier infrastructure. We've moved away from US-based hosting to a company called OVH Cloud, which is based out of Europe. So we have tape storage in Europe. That sort of geopolitical redundancy outside of North America. But of course, that doesn't hedge against the fact that if we are defunded or if we are compelled to delete, that is still sort of our copy. And even if it's in the EU, it could still be at risk. At least it's not at risk in the same way that if we were using AWS infrastructure, where the Cloud Act might represent a risk. So that's what we're doing at UVic. Next slide, please. But really, I think we need to start thinking about this idea of a collective lifeboat and how we exit the national jurisdiction or the provincial jurisdiction, and how succession plans for our platforms like Borealis and for our local collections that may be at risk. So looking beyond technical failures and considering large-scale geopolitical and national instabilities as legitimate threats to data persistence is really key here. Folks can Google while I'm talking here what Estonia did in partnership with Luxembourg after it suffered a major cyber attack. This idea that we could fund a facility somewhere outside of our jurisdiction to keep safe our most precious research data collections through this kind of Estonian data embassy model might be something that we need to start thinking about. How do we think beyond our borders in terms of protecting our data, and how do we do that as a community, and how do we do that proactively so that that sort of core trust seal succession planning bit is not just about migrating off of a specific platform, or when the research fund runs out, we'll find a partner. It's about proactively working around shared custody and data refuges that may allow us to survive something like the political targeting of data sets within our custody, where the institution itself, the research library itself, becomes a target. And we're not used to thinking of that. We're kind of used to thinking of being the copy of Last Resort where it's going to be safe. But I think we need to move beyond that. And that's really what my presentation, I hope, gets people thinking about today. Next slide. Thanks very much. I really appreciate your attention.
Merci beaucoup, Corey. Thank you very much. So now we are shifting to our Q&A period. So we encourage you to raise your hand, type in the chat, We also do have some prepared questions as well for our panelists, so we'll try to get through everyone's questions. Donc, nous avons notre période de questions-réponses maintenant. Je vous encourage à lever votre main, mettre vos questions dans la boîte de clavardage. Nous avons aussi préparé quelques questions pour nos panélistes. Donc, nous allons essayer de répondre à tout ça. Pour commencer, je ne sais pas s'il y a des mains levées, je pas trop cet aspect-là de Zoom, mais pour commencer, nous avons notre première question qui est que conseilleriez-vous aux personnes et aux institutions qui ne savent pas comment procéder pour préserver les données de recherche? À votre avis, quelle serait la première démarche à accomplir? Our first question is, what advice do you have for individuals or institutions who are unsure of how to move forward with research data preservation? What would you consider the most important first step? I'll open it up to the panelists. Who wants to speak first while we, get people writing in the chat and putting in their questions.
I can maybe start us off, Alyssa, if that's okay. I think I alluded a bit to this in my presentation, but I am very much the first step. I think very often that the first step is know what you have, because you can't build a plan for how to move forward if you don't know what you have. And in some instances, that may be going to different departments and depending on what kind of context you work in and trying to figure out what they have as well, to provide guidance down the road. So I think we tend to leap into technology as a solution, but as I noted, the first step I think is really know what you have, so you know what technology or tools you need to use. I have some other ideas, but if anybody else wants to chime in, please feel free to do so.
I can jump in as well. I completely agree with what Amanda said. Figuring out what you're working with is a great first step, so that you can sort of make plans from there. And you don't have to have the most granular information from the outset either. You can start with how many data sets are in your collection. Just start with very small, precise questions that are not too overwhelming to get answers to, and then gradually you can sort of build up that information that you're working with. I think another thing that people can get tripped up on is the idea of best practice. There is community developed best practices, and they are very good references to look at. But digital preservation is very context and institution specific. So sort of using the best practices developed by the community as a sort of guide to make sure you're going in the general right direction, but setting your goals based on what resources and time you have available, and what priorities you have and the risks that are local to your community. So if all the time you have is to just gather that information about what you're working with, then that's sort of the practice that you set for yourself. If you have more time and you can get more information about the formats that you're working with, then that's great. But it's all very incremental, and because we're looking at such long time horizons with digital preservation, we're not looking at endgame. We're just looking to hand the baton to the next runner. So the pressure is also not to make everything perfect in the moment.
And I think just to add to what Julie said, to build off each other, I guess, because you have to hand off that baton, make sure you document everything so other people know what was done in the past and how to move forward.
And I see we have some questions in the chat, so I'll just maybe add one last thing. As in terms of the skill set for digital preservation, there's a lot of jargon that gets thrown around and a lot of terms and activities. But one way in the research data context that can maybe help make it a more familiar field to enter into is just to think of preservation as curation on repeat for a very long time. So a lot of the activities are similar, just looking at a much longer time horizon.
Thank you very much. So I think we'll jump over to some questions that we have from our attendees. So the first one is any tools or resources to help researchers to identify mandatory raw/process data to keep. We cannot realistically keep everything forever. Donc, pour traduire, est-ce que il y a certains outils ou certaines ressources qui aideraient les chercheurs à identifier les données qui doivent être gardées, donc les données traitées, les données brutes à garder. Donc, il est impossible de tout garder pour toujours. So, do any of our panelists feel free to unmute? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a question I often grapple with in trying to bring preservation more towards the deposit phase of the life cycle. I'm going to say, be honest, Virginie, I don't have anything right off the top of my head that I could just send you. We do, and I'll put the links in the chat. We do have like a one-page primer for researchers of what you should think about it in terms of what needs long-term preservation. So that is something that is available. And if you're working with larger, if you're working with model data, there are some resources and questionnaires that are available that could maybe help you kind of filter down what needs to be kept within your research. We also have, FERDR has some criteria internally that we use too to decide what goes through long-term preservation and what we call appraisal. We're kind of beefing that up hopefully over the next year, and that would be something we'll be sharing with the community as that progresses.
And so I think this next question is a little bit more towards Corey's presentation. So is there a legal lever that would allow an institution that has stored data in a safe overseas jurisdiction to oppose a potential mandate to destroy this data? Would making it explicitly part of the public domain be a part of the strategy for an institution to safeguard their data against such overreach? Donc, do my best to translate it. Donc, c'est la question qui s'adresse peut-être un peu plus à Corey. Donc, est-ce qu'il existe certains outils du côté légal pour permettre aux institutions qui ont stocké leurs données dans des juridictions internationales qui sont sécuritaires, qui pourraient leur permettre de s'opposer au mandat qui demanderait de détruire ces données-là? Est-ce que utiliser une licence du domaine public pourrait faire partie des stratégies d'une institution pour protéger leurs données contre des mandats un peu, un peu drastiques? Corey, I'll turn it over to you if you have something.
Thanks, Alyssa, and thanks, Thomas, for the question. And there are undoubtedly people on this call that would be able to answer this better than I could. I wish we had more time to talk about it. But what I'm, there's sort of like the locks approach where lots of copies keep stuff safe. So there's all of these distributed servers outside of jurisdictions, and that would work really well with open data. But I think with research data, it gets pretty complicated pretty quickly in terms of rights and things like that. But to sidestep that issue just for a moment, my thinking was that if the community could help fund an independent organization that was based in another jurisdiction, and if our agreements were such that that organization also had custody of the material, then it would be independent from a Canadian-based or a British Columbia-based or whatever it might be organization. How that funding might work, I don't know. It might be, bringing a big pool of money together that research libraries pool, and then having the organization fund a position off of the investments from that money, something like that. But again, it gets complicated pretty quickly, but it is something that I do think we need to start thinking about. Not sure if any of the other panelists have thoughts.
Can always circle back to the question. Of course, this is a very complex issue. So if you don't have anything off the top of your head, this is a discussion period, so we can get back to it a little bit later. Si vous avez des pensées du côté à propos de ça, vous pouvez retourner sur cette question-là. Notre prochaine question Donc, est ouverte un peu à tous. Donc, our next question is, it's open to all panels. I think it's a bit more general, but it's many institutions have a lot of constraints right now on resources and staffing. What support have you had from upper administrations, funder, et cetera, in making these projects happen? And how did you work to get that started? Il y a beaucoup d'établissements qui ont des restrictions, des contraintes du côté des ressources et du personnel. Quelle sorte de soutien avez-vous eu du côté des administrations, des agences de bourse et de fonds, et puis pour s'assurer que ces projets soient mis en action, et puis qu'est-ce que vous avez fait pour obtenir ce soutien-là? We'll open it up to our panelists. These are tricky questions.
Yeah, you guys are really throwing some good questions at us. I mean, I think I'm going to take a bit of a gloomy look on this. I don't think a lot of institutions are getting support. And that's why maybe some of my fellow panelists are not going to unmute themselves and participate in this discussion. Realistically, preservation isn't super shiny and lovely and front-facing, so a lot of those resources go towards, funding things that are more immediate for researchers. Like, I want to deposit something, I want to have a versioning system, I want to have a place to put my sensitive data. And like I said, preservation is an afterthought. And you can't really, to be fair to some organizations, you can't really see the return on investment right away. So that also complicates things when getting support. Sorry, Sarah, I didn't want to change the tone of the presentation and of the panel into some gloomy discussion, but I think that's unfortunately the reality. And I'm not sure if this kind of maybe ties into this idea that maybe we're too siloed as well as a profession, and we need to branch out and work more with each other to figure out how to mitigate some of these constraints.
I don't know if this is a great answer, and because it's just so context specific, right? Like every institution operates differently. But I know like in some cases, and this is outside of like the research data side of my role, but like finding that kind of angle that speaks more to administrators can be helpful. Like sometimes an ask for like something gets a no, but then if you say like you spin it in a certain way, like maybe there's a little AI tool that we can just integrate a little bit into the project, and then they get really excited about it, and then it becomes a project they're willing to get behind. Not that I'm a big fan of AI, but like where you can get your ins, like sometimes just that like little tweaking, like again, like I've had a little more like traction on projects if like we talked about how it has like environmental impacts on like what we're doing, and sometimes I don't know, just being a little bit creative somehow liberates a few little creative pots of money that administrators might be able to make available. But again, it's pretty institution specific, so maybe not helpful, but.
These are tricky questions and can get a bit depressing sometimes, but at least the fact that we're all here is a good first step. Donc, que le ton peut changer, mais le fait qu'on est tous ici à en parler, je pense que c'est une bonne première étape. Peut-être qu'on peut passer à la prochaine diapositive pour la question. Tanya, would you mind switching to the next slide? Thank you. Donc, pendant que d'autres questions surviennent, je vais poser la question à nos panélistes. Pouvez-vous énumérer des solutions potentielles pour améliorer les capacités en matière de préservation des données de recherche, en particulier dans un climat de restriction budgétaire? Donc, c'est un peu en lien avec ce qu'on vient de discuter. Just to follow up, what opportunities do you see for building capacity in research data preservation, especially given a climate of shrinking budget? And I think this is the last question we'll have time for, but I will open it up to everyone.
Okay, well, everybody on this panel really knows me, so they know I'm going to just jump in. I think one of the first steps that we actually have to do is figure out what's what in the Canadian landscape. And what I mean by that is that a lot of these people on the panel, I serve on 3 or 4 different committees with, and we're all in the same committees, and there's different committees, and that takes time away from the hands-on work. So what are we duplicating our efforts by having all these different groups? And is there a way we can maybe make a massive group or with working group or things like that? Like looking at that landscape is the first step because that takes a lot of capacity away from doing the work. Now, that doesn't address the budget issue. I'm aware of that, but that could help with the workload issue that we all face. And that may be unpopular, and that's okay too.
And just to build on that, there are many working groups that we do have, and I think sort of trying to find a bit more strategic alignment between the groups, if we talk in admin speak, to make sure that there isn't that overlap and that we are sort of um, addressing things in a way that um, is a bit more strategic and making sure that the work that we do can sort of build on um, the work of each group builds on each other's work, if that makes sense. Um, and I think something else that we do have in Canada is a lot of shared infrastructure. So um, thinking about how we can bring the community together to continue building out that shared infrastructure. Corey spoke to a bit of that. There is always that question of where does the money come from for this? A perennial question for us. But I think having more voices behind any of these asks, any of these sort of visions for the shared infrastructure is always helpful, and also makes sure that we can address as many use cases and needs and requirements as possible, because there is a huge range of institutions and institutional contexts, from the really small to the very large, but also like the very large with very few resources dedicated to preservation. But then you also have the small that have more interests in preservation. So making sure that we hit all of those axes as much as possible by um, having venues for us to share our experiences and knowledge and discuss paths forward.
Very much. I think, Tanya, if you don't mind moving forward to next slide again to the second last. We'll just close off the webinar. As we are quite at time, but we wanted to extend a very big thank you to our panelists for sharing their experiences and perspective, and to everyone who attended for engaging in with this conversation. And we really hope that this is sort of like a starting point and we can continue this discussion with everyone. So the recording of the event will be shared with everyone who's registered, and you will also see a post-event survey once you leave the webinar. We would love to get your feedback, so feel free to share that with you. Donc, c'est tout pour aujourd'hui. Je tiens vraiment à remercier tous nos panélistes qui ont partagé leur expérience et leur point de vue. Et merci aussi à tous ceux et celles qui ont été présents aujourd'hui avec nous. Nous espérons pouvoir continuer cette belle conversation avec vous. Juste un petit rappel que l'enregistrement de ce webinaire va être partagé à tous ceux et celles qui se sont inscrits. Et puis, nous allons aussi avoir un sondage à la fin du webinaire pour avoir vos commentaires et vos rétroactions. Donc, c'est tout pour nous. Il est à 13h30. Thank you very much, everyone. And well, we will see you next time.